we're going to go ahead and get started. I wanted to start by welcoming everyone to Managing the Risks of Generative AI, part of the Responsible AI Institute's virtual event series. My name is Anna Blue, and I'm a social impact fellow at the Responsible AI Institute. Before coming to my current work as a graduate student at Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs, I spent 3 years working in crisis management at Meta, where I led a team that worked on preventing user and reputational harm and helped respond to misleading and manipulative information. I also had the opportunity at Meta to work on the company's first deepfake policy. And so I'm thrilled to be here today to discuss generative AI risks and particularly the recent proliferation of deepfake voice, image, and videos. We will be roughly talking about a few different themes this morning because I wanted to go ahead and introduce those ahead of time, and then I'll turn it over to the speakers to introduce themselves. So today we'll be touching on the business impacts of deepfakes and generative AI at large. We'll also talk about the societal impact of deepfakes and the communities that deepfakes impact the most. And then we can talk a little bit about what we can expect from generative AI in the future and maybe how we can respond to those issues. And with that, I'd love to turn it over to our fantastic panelists to introduce themselves. Christina, if you don't mind, I'd love to start with you.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks for having me. My name is Cristina Lopez, and I'm a senior analyst at Graphica on Graphica's Intel team. At Graphica, we research networks of influence and social media information operations, and lately, increasingly, this includes actors, behaviors, and content that relates to the use of generative AI. Before joining Graphica, I managed State and Society's Disinformation Action Lab, where we focused on network responses to communications threats directed at the 2020 census. Previously, I was Deputy Director on Extremism at Media Matters, a political media watchdog, where I specialized on analyzing extremist networks and the narratives they spread. Happy to pass it on to my fellow panelists.
Awesome. Thanks, Christina. We're lucky to have you today. Sophie, why don't you jump in next?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me too. I am Sophie Compton. I co-founded the campaign My Image, My Choice, which aims to amplify survivor stories of image-based sexual violence and specifically deepfake abuse. We've got a kind of coalition of many survivors that have spoken out, and we've worked with them to share their testimonies with the White House, with the World Economic Forum, with the Law Commission, feeding into new laws that are being created around this issue in many different places, and also a lot of press work. So like a big article recently in Rolling Stone, work with the BBC, CNN, ABC, etc. And I also co-directed the documentary Another Body, which follows a student's search for justice after she discovers that she's been targeted by deepfake sexual abuse. So have been working to bring survivor testimony out into the world.
Awesome. Wow, I'm very excited to hear a little bit more about what you've been up to lately, Sophie. Ramsey, I think last but not least.
Thanks, Anna. My name is Ramsey Brown. I'm the CEO and founder of Mission Control AI. We build infrastructure, software, conduct exercises, literacy trainings, and sense making for the defense and commercial enterprise around generative AI, focusing on enablement, literacy, and trust. Before this, I was the head of data science at a digital therapeutics company. Previously done app before that, working on behavioral engineering at a company called Dopamine Labs that I founded. And my focus has largely been throughout different facets of my career on the emerging relationship between humans and AI as AI capabilities increase. This has put us in direct interface supporting organizations like the Department of State, the Department of Defense, and NATO. We most recently convened the Global Leaders in Responsible AI Summit for the second year at Cambridge University, which is our annual summit, co-hosted by our friends and colleagues at Booz Allen Hamilton. We're very grateful to have opening remarks from Department of Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff as we did an interactive 70-person workshopping exercise for coming to understand the threats from deepfakes, especially around the 2024 democratic election landscape worldwide. So I'm very grateful to be here today because I find this a really timely topic to be discussing.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear it and looking forward to hearing from your wealth of experience today, Ramsey. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump into our first topic. And as a brief reminder, we'll just be talking broadly about the business impact of generative AI and specifically deepfakes. So from identity fraud to financial theft, there's a lot that can go wrong for businesses when it comes to AI generated deepfakes. Christina, I would love to start with you on this topic. Do you think you can help us kind of set the scene here? What are the biggest Gen AI issues for companies? And in what ways are companies typically vulnerable to deepfakes?
So glad I got the easy question here. So manipulated and just synthetic media in general have existed for decades, and the threat of fake media is not something that businesses are new necessarily to having to contend with. But what is definitely different now is how increasingly accessible this technology is. And so with this new capabilities that have been given to a wide range of actors that are now experimenting and fine tuning what the best application and uses are, we have seen that the big tactical takeaway is the scale of what you have to deal with as commercial organizations. It just got a lot bigger. And so the first immediate impact of this barrier to entry getting lower and lower is that this is no longer technology that is monopolized by nation states or like really well-funded Hollywood like productions. We are now encountering like PR and communications firms that are conducting these sort of activities on behalf of paying clients. So this will start to extend to smaller organizations and individuals who, now have the access to commercially available technology that can produce really credible and high quality results. And so the thing is, while the threat of deepfakes will continue to just be a challenge in the scale that business have to contend with, the biggest issue is that just the existence of the technology brings up an erosion of trust. And so the fact that these capabilities and technologies give bad actors just a bigger range of action just makes it for everyone to have a little bit of doubt about the authenticity of what they're looking at. It makes communication, authentic communication for businesses and their audiences much more complex. And it makes threats to a bigger scale of something that you have to be worried about.
Christina, I really appreciate that perspective, considering the fact there's been such a huge push lately to democratize AI and make AI accessible to everyone and really make sure the benefits of AI are distributed evenly. And so I think considering the downsides of that push are really important for companies and for organizations as a whole. Ramsey, I'm curious because Mission Control AI spends a lot of time helping companies use Gen AI responsibly. So I was hoping you could tell us about your approach to safely and securely integrating Gen AI into workplace and workforce efforts and some of the major challenges of that work.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. And Christina, I first want to reflect on and appreciate your answer just briefly. I think that you really touched on what is, I think, going to be the cornerstone conversation of the 2024 to 2029 timescale, as more of our lives exist in digital spaces, and digital spaces become contested information spaces, both for notions of traditional interstate competition, like between state level actors, but then for a narrowing attention span and a narrowing consumer discretionary spend. I think the thing you're pointing to of the thing that we risk losing is our semblance of consensus ground truth, and consensus ground reality is going to become the baseline conversation. And the egregious failure mode is one of exhaustion, in which consumers, voters, citizens, and members of customer-facing organizations that are responsible for keeping up their side of the social contract all collectively throw their hands up and say, well, I guess you can't trust anything anymore. And it's getting to that exhaustion point where our traditional notions of the way that that institutions interact with one another, or that people interact with institutions via different flavors of social contract, starts fundamentally breaking down. So if they think about like what you're describing, that's like the end goal to like lift up and support. As far as what this looks like, then supporting companies who are looking to integrate generative AI into both their acceleration of workforce augmentation through the use of generative AI as co-pilots or the facilitation of work, or through the automation pathways of incorporating generative AI technologies directly into business unit operations and technology stacks themselves. We look at this through the perspective, and gratefully through our collaborations with organizations like the Responsible AI Institute, as like everything else being an interaction of, you do need technical solutions that are capable of doing things like real-time operation and control over the flow of information between people and generative systems. So you need those living guardrails and living real-time control firewall apparatuses. Guardrails is everyone's favorite word right now, and I think most people think it narrowly points to a PowerPoint slide that you circulated and hoped everybody read really well about do's and don'ts, and that's not what guardrails are. By definition, guardrails on a road are hard parts of infrastructure that you can crash cars into, and cars don't go off roads. That's what guardrails are supposed to do. And we build and deploy these technical guardrails for organizations to be able to implement such that they can at least maintain visibility and accountability into how people are interacting with their generative systems. On top of that, we have to realize that technology is insufficient for solving human problems. We need, as a field, a higher throughput way to upskill and improve literacy for both the technical staff who are responsible for the implementation of new technologies, as well as the end user knowledge worker staff who are responsible for consuming and using these technologies. And by a combination of improvements to culture, improvements to training, and improvements to the underlying infrastructure, teams are able to start experimenting a lot faster because they're able to build confidence in what they're doing, as opposed to, well, we're going to either wait and see what the field does, in which they start falling behind economically, or we're just going to let it rip. And then you have everything from data loss crises of confidence with your end customers and community or regulators getting involved. So we see it as a combination of, you do need hard infra, and you do need training. You do need to be able to embrace your people and your processes around this and cook it into job descriptions, cook it into performance reviews, cook it into culture.
Ramsey, I had to laugh a little bit at the fact at you saying guardrails are everyone's favorite word today, because I see it everywhere. So it's very on point. And then to the point you made earlier about, the exhaustion that people are feeling right now, I think I was thinking nostalgically back to when social media first started and everyone said social media was information overload. And now to think how, quickly things have changed, and now it's just like complete exhaustion overload when it comes to deciphering what the truth is. Kind of funny.
But it's noise overload instead of signal overload, and the signal
Yes.
to noise worsening to the point where now we're contending with what does it mean to have the photographic fidelity of the synthesis of reality itself as a fundamental breakdown, and there being a consensus event stream. And you do need consensus event streams to be able to operate functioning democracies. And we have 65 general elections this year across the world.
Yeah, I know 2024 is going to be a big year, frightening in some ways, but also, like you said, it might be the impetus we need to come together and fix human problems. Sophie, I wanted to shift gears a little bit and talk maybe more about the people organizations, malicious actors behind deepfakes. So with that in mind, I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about why people create deepfakes, what their motives are, and if there's anything companies can do, like collaborate with law enforcement or promote greater transparency to prevent bad actors from using Gen AI against them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think it's important to establish that deepfake is a technology. Deepfaking is a technology that can be used for good or ill. I believe it has incredible positive applications, for example, in journalism, to allow a source to tell their story in a way that captures their essence, but protects their identity by using a face veil. If somebody's like lost their voice in a tragic accident and their voice they can speak as like themselves. But what I think we're talking about here is more specifically deepfake abuse. Deepfakes can be abused for different reasons, but it's really important, I believe, to frame the reality of what's happening on the ground is that 96% of deepfake abuse is non-consensual pornography of women. So that's not to downplay the potential and the real threats that these are having in terms of electoral interference. I think we need to take that seriously. But I also think that the emphasis has historically been so much on that part of the problem. And we know that the people who are being demonstrably harmed day in, day out are women and minoritized people and LGBT people. So the people that are making deepfakes for political interference have very different intentions. But the field that I've been looking into is looking at deepfake sexual abuse. And the landscape of that is that the majority of deepfake videos that are being posted, deepfake sexual abuse videos, are being posted on sites dedicated to that practice. And we talked about the finances and the business ramifications, but deepfake sexual abuse is itself an industry now. It's no longer a cottage industry. There are quite well-established sites who are running ads, receiving, ad payments, who have forums where individual creators are commissioning and charging money to make deepfake sexually abusive people. We also have a lot of people that are doing it probably not for financial gain. A lot of people that are doing it because there's a sense of cultural permissibility. So if you go on a so-called mainstream, and they are now sadly becoming mainstream deepfake abuse websites, it's kind of marketed as another genre of porn. And there are many young boys, especially, who are making it of their classmate, of their friend. Christina talked about the low barrier to entry, and that low barrier to entry, coupled with a complete lack of regulation, has created a climate where people may not even be aware that what they're engaging in is a deeply harmful, abusive practice that can be extreme, that can be, Professor Claire McGlynn uses the phrase life-shattering. And that's the reality that I've seen on the ground. Something as well that's important is quite a lot of when there has been legislation around this, often the laws have required the intent to cause distress as a kind of threshold to pursue this as an issue. And what we're seeing is that, yes, in some cases the intent is to shame, humiliate, and harass in a very direct way. It's very misogynistic and gendered in the vast majority of cases. But also people are doing it because they think it's fun, because they don't think it's a big deal. And there's a real narrative of minimization, which we see on these forums. But sadly, that minimization is also then replicated across the institutions that should be protecting us in society. So many victims, when they call the police, they get, "What did you do to call this upon yourself?" So the protagonist of our film, Taylor, when she called the police, they said, "What did you do to call this upon yourself?" And he had every right to do this because it's not illegal. So they both minimized and victim blamed, which is, something that we see sadly all too often.
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, I was actually shocked by the statistic you shared. I had no idea it was 96%. And I think your point is very topical right now. I don't know if you guys saw, but yesterday, NCMEC, which I'm trying to remember what the NCMEC acronym stands for, but I think it's like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They had released a report yesterday saying that there was about a 12% increase in children's abuse between last year and this year. And a lot of that was due in part to AI and exploitative AI. So I just think, the point you were making about how widespread this abuse is and how vulnerable innocent people can be to it is really well taken.
Yeah, and we might get onto this later, but I think that what we've seen through spending a lot of time researching these forums and these spaces is that they're sites of radicalization. So it's not just the victimization of the individual, but it's also the cultural and social impact of a generation of young men being pulled into these extremely misogynistic communities. And, we're seeing some of the effects of that, the permissibility of people like Andrew Tate, etc., And there was a study that really shocked, but didn't in some ways surprise me, that came out recently in The Guardian that said that Gen Z young men are more likely to believe that feminism has done more harm than good than boomer men. And I think that there is this kind of fork in the road where, of course, there are a lot of Gen Z feminists, young men, but there is this growing group, or it's kind of almost a misogynistic pushback against some of the like progress that we've made on gender equality. And I think that these technologies are like a kind of rallying cry and a site where that is developing.
Totally. And it raises a lot of questions for companies about how they can protect their employees, especially at companies where they're working on sensitive or controversial issues and they're likely to be cited in media or online and become victim to attacks. Awesome. I think, Sophie, you might have actually anticipated my next question very well, because I was going to ask you a little bit about the societal impacts of deepfakes. I think I'm particularly curious, like, what the effects of deepfakes are on trust and dignity. And this almost relates back to Ramsey's point earlier about the fact we have elections coming up, and we can dig into that later. But I'm curious, like, Gen AI, what communities are most vulnerable to those attacks? And then how are those communities responding? How do they feel about it? What does it mean for our values as a society? That's a lot of questions for you, a lot of big ones.
Yeah, it's really great. I mean, I think that the most important, well, first I will say that the impact that this can have on individuals is devastating. So Taylor, the protagonist of our film, is a really typical case. And she's someone who, when she experienced this, the problem with experiencing often kind of deepfake sexual abuse and other forms of online violence is that you don't know who's done this. You often don't know who the perpetrator is. So there's a kind of threat vector that ripples across every part of your life. And I have had so many women, and it very much predominantly is women, say, I didn't want to leave the house because every time I walked past someone in the street, I thought, have they seen the videos? And even though rationally the chances of any individual seeing those videos that you cross in a street is so low, you just don't know. And there's that feeling and that sense of all of these eyes on you. Plus there's that sense of violation in that your body and your identity and your agency has been co-opted by someone. You've probably watched however many minutes of your face moving in ways you haven't done, your body moving in ways you haven't done. And you know, you have that sense of the eyes on you within that body. So researchers have found that the experiences are very similar to the experiences of tangible sexual assault, and that's PTSD, increased anxiety. In Taylor's case, she already struggled with OCD, and it was triggered massively. And she's someone who is a really kind of geeky engineering student who was really cared about her studies and was so excited to go to college. And she debated dropping out. So that I think that. And I've spoken to people that have decided not to pursue their dream careers, whether that's being a streamer, whether that's being a politician. So I think that what we really, really have to think about is the cultural impact of that. This abuse aims to shame and silence, and it is a very effective tool of silencing. People feel that sense of disempowerment, that sense of not wanting to speak out about it, because you might then increase greater, more people will go and look at the videos of you. You don't want to provoke the person that's done it any further. And I've spoken with a lot of people that are sometimes quite high profile, sometimes have high powered jobs, and the level of fear around speaking about this abuse is really, really, really high. And so I think that we kind of can't overstate the cultural impact of that silencing, and the way that in so many ways people shut out from social media, withdraw from their friendship groups, don't pursue the dream job that they had. It's really hard to quantify some of those impacts, but having spoken to so many survivors, that silencing is a thread that runs through every story. Even when it's someone like AOC, for example, who came out last week talking about the deepfake abuse, and she's someone who is extremely aware of what it's like to be in the middle of a media storm, has had eyes of all kinds on her, like probably one of the most thick-skinned operators in the world today. And yet the fact that she said, I found it really traumatizing. I found it really scary, and I didn't know if I would go public on the record to talk about it. I think that should give us a sense of the scale of that individual silencing, and give us reason to step back and think about what the broader societal impact of that if so many women especially are experiencing this. And final point, just to say, it is predominantly women, but also minoritized women. So women who are black have, or women who are women of color have additional risk factors. But yeah, it's predominantly a gendered problem at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. You talk about the silencing effect and the deep psychological trauma that these videos and these images create for people, but I also couldn't help but think about the silencing effect that deepfakes in other spaces have had on discourse and engagement. I know at Facebook we often talked a lot about echo chambers and being inside of an echo chamber, and maybe the fear of calling someone out on something manipulated or some type of deepfake that was shared within their social media channel or within their friend group. And I think often there's not just a silencing effect at the individual level, but at the societal level. I might be taking that effect a little bit too far, but I couldn't help but think about that. And then on that note, Christina, as we talked about a little bit, this is an election year in dozens of democracies around the world. And as someone with experience in information operations and media manipulation research, do you mind sharing with us a little bit about what you're most focused on right now, election related or not, and what the impact of deepfake proliferation is on good governance and democratic engagement?
Yeah, of course. I don't know how much I can share about things we're looking at now, election related, but one thing that I mentioned earlier that I think is pretty relevant here is how the accessibility has expanded the field for actors. Before, something like election interference was kind of high stakes and the kind of thing that only nation states would kind of get involved with. Now, this is the kind of thing that anyone with a credit card has access to. That also means that the stakes of the kinds of things that you want to interfere in have become lower and lower. So while we might think about election interference as, like big E elections, like presidential elections, we're talking about like school board elections. We're talking about parent-teacher association, like very localized elections that can also be manipulated by a well-placed audio, or just by the threat of a well-placed audio existing, where any communication related to that then becomes subject to this distrust. And one thing that we found that was interesting last year was this campaign that was appealing to voters in Burkina Faso to reject the pro-French candidate. It was pushing voters, trying to manipulate voters into supporting the pro-Russian candidate. And this campaign was interesting because it was done with commercially available AI generative video from a company named Synthesia, and it used a series of avatars that you could customize and have them speak in different languages. And they were using them as if they were reporters from what was seemingly like a reputable like news outlet, kind of just informing people. We were able to trace back this campaign not to a nation state, but to a single individual, just living in his apartment in New York. And the thing is, if this sort of power and scale of proliferation in terms of trying to appeal to a wide swath of voters can come from a single individual, you can also think what a bigger infrastructure with more tactical goals may want to do in different election settings. So just to summarize that, we now have a lot more actors to worry about, a bigger scale to contend with. The biggest issues in terms of election interference are that the quality of the fakes, the quality of the information that is now generated is a little bit better. So it's harder for the human to figure out what is authentic and what isn't. The ability to scale and to be more effective in different languages has now been given to a lot of actors. So you have a lot of actors that have expanded their capacities in terms of which territories they can exert their influence in. And to me, like the biggest challenge as researchers that we're encountering is that there is a huge gap between how fast this technology advances and how fast the tools we have at our availability to execute the proper like forensics and analysis that are able to tell us whether something is, like manipulated or synthetically generated or not. And we still very much need a human factor in the loop to provide the cultural context and topical expertise. And these two things are not advancing at the same time and at the same pace. So currently that's one of the biggest challenges in the sort of research that allows you to like just pinpoint threats to election integrity in general. And going back to what the biggest democracy and governance, I would have to go back to the erosion of trust and to the fact that, like Ramsey said, there is an exhaustion on the part of audiences in terms of trying to decipher what is real and what is not. And it doesn't even have to be that good, the technology, for it to make an impact, for people to already second guess whether something is authentic or not.
Yeah, definitely. And not to make light of the dark lessons behind your story, but it makes me laugh how many times I read like in Wired magazine or in the New York Times about how like extreme cyber attacks or deep fraud traces back to some person hanging out in their New York City apartment. So that does crack me up a little bit. Individual actors can be really powerful with this new tool. Um, Ramsey, I think you probably may want to jump in on this topic, but I also wanted to ask you a second question about this tension between innovation and safety or security. I know I dealt with this a lot at Meta because companies are struggling to balance implementing Gen AI in their own work and fending off AI generated attacks or problems. So, in addition to maybe chiming in on what we've talked about so far, I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about what society at large can do to support innovation and technological creativity while also reining in some of the issues produced by generative AI.
Yeah, sure. And then I did want to contribute to something that Sophie pointed to of two things that are kind of gut-wrenching of the broad spectrum of incredibly gut-wrenching facets of this. But Sophie, there's a thing you pointed to, and I think you properly put a lampshade on the term, but the fact that we have mainstream and not mainstream forums and marketplaces for this is deeply dark. Like the fact that we can include the word mainstream in front of that is profoundly unsettling in certain ways, because what it means is that this has rapidly moved into the Overton window of what is an acceptable use of technology writ large. And technology always implicitly encodes norms and values as a people, and technology can be viewed through a certain critical theoretical lens as a time-locked snapshot of what we thought mattered at a time. It's like taking a freeze frame of what we think is important. And that we have so many market options to choose from for a technology that should, and I will use should because I think there is a complete normative stance to be able to take against this and say, what the fuck? This is even now inside the Overton window, let alone we've got several market options at different price points and qualities. I don't think you're wrong in the sense of like, that's not factually accurate. I think you're completely correct. I find it incredibly frustrating that we're here, but that we're here doesn't mean we get to dig our head in the sand and say, well, no, we're just not going to think about it. We must directly engage. You pointed to the mainstreaming part, and you pointed to these places as loci of radicalization. And this conversation has appropriately focused on the fact that this is a predominantly masculine coded system and a predominantly masculine coded audience. And I don't even think that's like a from first principles thing. I think you can just go literally look at like the makeup of the distribution of the content itself and the direction of the asymmetry of cultural power and violence to realize like what's going on here. And I think you're right that these are radicalizing places that are part of a reciprocally causal feedback process. It's not just that the YouTube videos or the increasingly cringe podcasts get someone here. It's that once they're here, that gets them deeper into the entirety of the super cycle of a collapsed contemporary masculine identity for which a lot of young guys are trying to figure out, who am I supposed to be? What are supposed to be the things that matter to me? And how am I supposed to show up in this world? And these collectively engage in a slouching, a cultural and spiritual slouching in which, as the human attention span has become entirely monetized and in its monetization become a commodity available for exchange, predominantly through and almost explicitly driven by social media technologies in the past few years, when everything's just content, norms and values are super boomer and cringe. Everything's content. It doesn't matter. But the practice is, it actually does matter. These are actual people's lives. And the thing that I think you pointed to well, as you reflected to Anna, is that there's a terroristic edge to all of this, not capital T like state actor terror, but lowercase t in the sense of, part of the underlying motive here could be just to mess with people for the sheer purposes of, I'm bored. I'm bored, and my friends and I used to just get our rocks off on 4chan, and look what we can do now. And listless teenage boredom and a quest for identity previously was constrained to your bad post-punk music and a skate park. And now the bad post-punk music and the skate park has become the entire digital grounds. And as we live more and more of our lives intermediated by glass and an entirely digitized, owned walled gardens for which our every waking moment is a commodity that can be sold to an advertiser, these create incentive forces of the disillusion of self and the disillusion of traditional norms, for which the marginal penalty and the marginal cost for a young man to just kind of not give a shit and just kind of slouch towards, yeah, this is just fine, everyone does this, this is normal, is basically zero.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I think freaks me out in a personal sense as a man. And I look at like, what should a good, strong, healthy, masculine identity be shaped like? We don't have voices that are amplifying in these spaces faster or better than Joe Rogan or Andrew Tate or what's the crappy philosopher? The other one. Jordan Peterson. That was it. Right. Yeah, all you have to say is crappy philosopher.
Yeah, exactly. Got you.
But I see that it's hard for me to pull apart like, oh, deepfakes is a technology problem. Like, no, it's just a cultural slouching problem. And to say it's a cultural slouching problem and not a technology problem isn't to bury the subtlety of the technology or the importance of what we need to do to create incentive structures that are a combination of technical, political, and cultural around finding ways where this becomes a thing we don't want. This should be a thing that is guided not by there's going to be not just going to be harsh penalties for people engaged in behaviors like this, but that we've somehow made this a more appropriate thing to just be able to do. And it's that, and it's the overtonification of this that I look at with deep remorse. And the thing that gives me remorse is not only the harm that this does to the women's lives that this impacts, but that to unwind this feels like we'd have an easier time unwinding Facebook than we would unwinding this problem. Like, to me, this feels like this is part of the collective abdication of the fortitude, temperance, prudence, and justice from traditional Western or Aristotelian virtue ethics that got us this far into a, yeah, man, it's all content. Who cares? And it's that kind of attitude that to me makes this a little more self-fulfilling. But I'm really glad you kind of pointed at it through the mainstreaming part. And then to the question that you did throw over to me, around, how companies can be a part of this journey and a part of this process at the technical level. Our focus as an organization is largely around being able to deliver in those new capabilities that simultaneously create positive pathways to enablement and facilitate the pathways towards improving governance and trust from the execution of the technology directly by the end user operators. And I think that synthetic reality and synthetic media is going to have to become a larger part of the corporate AI governance conversation quite quickly, not simply for the relationship that an organization has between its local use of generative AI, so what we think of as traditional AI governance right now, but that the breakdown of our staff's ability to meaningfully trust that when they received that phone call from the VP of Human Resources, who was requesting some file to be sent over, that even now what previously might have been a 2022 phishing style cyber data exfiltration operation will now use more and more modalities that we still today consider to be real. Like I personally do not think anyone on this phone call is using any sort of technology more sophisticated than a background blur or virtual background right now. And I believe you all look like these people. And I believe that these faces that I see smiling and moving are these actual faces. That's not the case anymore. I just think that for a panel, none of us have booted up an open source generative overlay that would allow us to look like anyone or sound like anyone. And most people operate on that basic assumption that what I'm seeing is what's really going on. That means that from the corporate operational security landscape, there is an entire new class of both literacy and tool that's going to need to be rolled out very quickly for training people how to develop trust that the conversation they appear to be having, even over Zoom, with someone is what's actually going on. So we look at this not as a lot of companies are going to have problems with maybe our teams make deepfakes or use deepfake technologies, as much as this is going to happen to us from the outside nearly constantly.
Well, thank you guys so much for your thoughts on such a difficult subject. I think you guys grapple really well with it. And I think if you've been following the comments in the chat, people really identify with a lot of what you've been saying. So thank you. I know we only have 15 minutes left in our conversation, so I'll jump real quickly to our last few questions. And then if we have time, we'll jump to Q&A. So Ramsey, this is shifting gears a little bit, but there's been some regulation in this space already, especially from the FCC and the FTC. And I would love to hear your thoughts on whether you think there are examples of good regulatory or legislative responses to these issues. And if not, how else should local government, federal government, international government, et cetera, be tackling them?
Yeah, I'm gonna come out swinging with a crappy contrarian answer, because it is what we do think. But I know, like, the polite thing for me to say is like, oh yes, the laws, of course. America has consistently demonstrated that it is going to, in the downstream ghost of Thatcherism and Reaganism, continue to propagate that the most dangerous 9 words in the English language are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help," which is an actual Ronald Reagan quote. And it's reflected in a regulatory capture approach that's being done on Capitol Hill, Chuck Schumer's AI forum exercises, in which he invites in the CEOs of hyperscalers and frontier model labs every now and then to tell him what the regulation is supposed to be, is going to be the state's pro-regulatory capture, pro-innovation default stance and approach. This is being combined with a fine reading of the Office of Management and Budget's memorandum downstream of Biden's executive order in October, in which, yes, it was ostensibly about trust and security, mostly around frontier models, but it's open season for purchasing AI for the federal government, the intelligence community, and the Defense Department. America is sitting on a $2 trillion homegrown juggernaut of NVIDIA, for which no one's going to meaningfully regulate that thing. No one's going to meaningfully be the person who comes out swinging and has to reach across the aisle at a federal level and implement a downstream of Brussels approach to crafting federal level laws and regulations around the decisive strategic technology of the 21st and 22nd century, for which we have a head start, the most hardware, the most scientists, and the cheapest and most abundant energy sources to have asymmetric dominance globally for the rest of the human future. No one's regulating that. We've got the golden goose, and that's an uncomfortable realpolitik way to look at it. What will happen, I believe, is that we'll devolve regulation down to industry regulators and down to states. Almost every state now has some form of an AI bill on the books, but the federal government, I don't think, is going to do anything that is going to be as draconian as what we've seen over in Brussels, and that's probably to net benefit. That said, the thing that keeps me up at night, there's like maybe two things in AI that keep me up at night. I'm not really worried about being curb stomped by T1000 next year, but I am deeply worried about job displacement, and I'm deeply worried about the election cycle. And even if the Federal Trade Commission executes its plans against outlawing domestically generated deepfake voice calls for the election cycle, that does not stop someone in an apartment building in Minsk running consumer-grade hardware, running a speech-to-text language model and then text-to-speech engine, masking using a phone number from Alabama and dialing every pensioner in Bakersfield, California for a ad nauseum, as long as they want, bi-directional, realistic, retrieval augmented generated phone call with Joe Biden and Donald Trump, for the sole purpose of completely polluting the trust and information landscape with myriad fractal versions of a boots on the ground truth. And to that 65-year-old pensioner in Bakersfield, they're going to have to contend with what's more likely, that Joe Biden actually called them, because sometimes presidents do cute stuff like that when they're like on the campaign trail. They stop by the local pub, they visit a factory, they go to a phone bank, or that those idiots in San Francisco finally broke real life itself. And the more parsimonious answer is likely to be that Donald Trump and Joe Biden are actually calling. And it's that the low price point, to Christina's point earlier, and the massively available consumer grade hardware that could run massively automated, just disinformation, misinformation, hybrid warfare, digital contested spaces types of operations totally outside of American jurisdiction, which no laws apply. We can't apply a law to that. That is, I think, the thing that keeps us up. Sorry, that's okay. So now I've said law is not going to happen. Someone please tell me that law is totally going to happen.
No, we go for the contrarian answers. There's no problem there. I will say, yeah, I think on the state AI bills, I've been studying those recently, and it's interesting that a lot of states seem to be approaching this from the data privacy angle. And when it comes to like hard bills on regulating AI at the state level, even I haven't seen that many. They acknowledge AI's potential and they form AI commissions, but there's not too much that can be done, I think, about like preventing too much AI interference, or like regulating AI to make sure that processes don't become more unequal and more unfair. But on that positive note, Sophie, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your activism in this space. First, do you want to add anything on the regulation and legislation front? And then second, if you could send out one call to action, what would it be?
Okay. So much to say. Firstly, I share the pessimism, Ramsey, but I also believe that we have to force action and that we can, because I'm an activist. So it's miraculous what a field can do. And I've seen, even Okay, backtrack. For me, the vital piece, as you pointed out, is tech accountability. And one piece of evidence to illustrate that: Google is single-handedly responsible for 70% of web traffic to deepfake abuse sites. Google is not only allowing people, not de-indexing these sites, not considering them harmful content, not, like child sexual abuse material, etc. It is going way beyond that in terms of promoting and facilitating the explosion of this problem. More deepfake sexual abuse videos were posted in 2023 than the total number from every other year in history combined. So that's a rate of exponential growth. And that is because companies like Google not only allow you to find this content, Google's policies say we won't provide people with explicit or shocking content that they were not looking for. So why, when I Google Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez's thoughts on deepfakes, a prominent politician who's just proposed legislation on this subject, do I get serviced non-consensual intimate image abuse, deepfake sexual abuse videos of that person at the top of Google? So the explosion of the sexual component and the sexual abuse component of this technology has been facilitated, propped up, and funded by big tech. Yes, it's going to be a challenge to get random unknown user A who's hiding behind a VPN, whose kind of deepfake site server might be hosted from God knows where. One, finding that person is going to be difficult. Two, getting that site shut down is going to be difficult. But why is that site accessible on the mainstream internet? There is absolutely it absolutely should not be assumed that this is the status quo. I think that the question of getting tech accountability is hard, but I actually think, and this is probably wildly naive, but I do believe that the growing public outrage around deepfakes is a slight thorn in the side of companies like Google, because there are a growing number of people, and thankfully this is built off survivors sharing their stories and saying, I absolutely will not accept that your pathetic failed attempts to address this problem. I will not accept that the status quo is that I have to have a full-time job managing this abuse, and I have to be sending you link after link after link after link to take down. And the tragic reality is that there are some very powerful, high-profile people who have now been targeted by this technology and who are on the sharp edge of this issue, such as many prominent female politicians, such as actors, etc. And what we're trying to do is build a movement around that says, we will not accept this. You're going to have to figure something out, because Google should not be driving traffic to these sites. Microsoft should not be hosting. Microsoft should not be allowing its AI tools to be their guardrails to be so woefully breached. It's insane that X's response to viral deepfake abuse of Taylor Swift was to mean that you can't search for her name, and that the way around that was to misspell her name by one letter. It's insane that Microsoft has AI image generating software, which you can't say create Taylor Swift porn, but you can say use her name again misspelled by one letter, and then say take off the top, take off the this, take off the that, until you get to the end result, or apply whatever else you want. So we are letting these companies not even do the bare minimum, but almost laugh in our face in terms of their willingness to protect. So I think that one of the massive things that is allowing them to do this in the US is Section 230. I think that, and this is where the small piece of optimism comes in again, because when we started working on this issue, every congressperson or senator that we spoke to, if you brought up the word Section 230, they would come out in hives and they would basically end the meeting. That has changed. And there is a growing awareness that the giving online businesses complete free pass from liability maybe made sense at the time, but doesn't make sense now. And that we need to develop regulatory regimes. We need to develop duties of care. We need to develop systems around the use of these technologies. I would say in the case of deepfakes actually in particular, it's a cultural issue, not a technological issue. I think that there are some other forms of AI regulation that is much more your guys' expertise that are probably harder and more nuanced to create. But the mass scale violation and violence against women that is being enabled, even if you find it hard, even if it is complex, the conversations around open source material and how do you protect and what the rights and responsibilities of researchers are, and some misinformation, disinformation, bad actor use of these technologies. As I said, 96% of deepfake abuse is non-consensual porn of women, and these are on websites that are literally visible and accessible 3 clicks away on Google. That's not a given. I do believe that we can change that. The UK is making possible moves. The EU is making possible moves. We're gonna have to do the same in the US. And yeah, the final note on that is that it's slightly terrifying, the thought of how different the landscape may be depending on who the next president of the United States is, in terms of the just internet climate and culture that we'll be dealing with, and the kind of Overton window again of what will be possible.
Thanks, Sophie. I know we only have 2 minutes left. Christina, I would love to end with you. I have 2-part question for you. I'm just going to sneak an extra one in there. So first, I'd love for you to share what you think is the next big thing that will happen in this space, good or bad. And then if you have any resources you want to share with our audience today that you think would be helpful for them to keep up to date on this issue, that'd be great as well.
Awesome. I'll try to be so brief. I think it's the easy part of predicting what will come in this space is that we can always put our money that there will be more, faster, and better. And what I mean by that is that there will be more apps that make Gen AI accessible to more audiences. Computing power will be better, and it will make for faster results. And the outputs are going to just get better in quality, and it's going to be increasingly even harder to decipher the authenticity and sources of outputs. And we have talked about this technology, rightly so, as a moral neutral, but the issue is that currently we are seeing that the societal progresses that this technology brings also has harms that are being shouldered by individuals, and that is increasingly a problem, where we're going to see that the normalization of exploitation will then become a societal harm in itself. And I do worry about the more, faster, and better equation applied to the current state of harms in this space. As for resources, I would love to point everyone to graphica.com, where you can find some of our research that includes her work regarding non-consensual intimate imagery apps, and some reports on the use of Gen AI on election interference.
Awesome.
Can I really quickly shout out?
Go for it.
One is, follow and look up My Image, My Choice and see the work that we're doing. And there's like survivor support materials and stories, etc. But also we have a dossier of research which really brings together the landscape of deepfake sexual abuse, which is not yet publicly available. But if anybody is interested in receiving it, it's quite exhaustive and in-depth. Then you can reach out to My Image, My Choice and request it, and we'll send it to you. And final thing, everyone support the Defiance Act, which is the first might actually pass federal legislation on deepfake sexual abuse that we will get over the line as a first step.
Awesome. I love that as a rallying cry to end on, Sophie. Thank you all so much for coming today. This recording will be on the Ray YouTube channel by the end of next week, so you can check it out there. And then lastly, if you need anything else or you want to follow the other work of the Responsible AI Institute, you can check out the Institute's work at responsible.ai. Thank you all so much for coming.